So in the last commentary, I talked a little bit about the mind-body problem. I'm trying to just say what that problem was in a little bit more detail. But with this commentary, we're going to start to talk about some solutions to the problem, or attempted solutions to the problem, starting with what's known as mind-body dualism. So to begin with, just to clarify what dualism is, it's helpful to just make clear what dualism is not. That is, what it's contrasted with. And what it's typically contrasted with is what's called monism. So according to monism, the idea is that each of us is, as a minded individual, has a brain, a physical brain, and our mind, the workings of our mind can really be understood entirely in terms of the workings of that physical brain. So there's no real metaphysical difference between ourselves as minded agents and the material world. Dualists deny that. According to dualists, the material world is at some remove, metaphysically speaking, from the mind. So we think of ourselves as minded individuals. That mindedness can be traced to our having characteristics, which cannot be understood in any way in terms of what the material world is like or what it consists in. This is a view which has been widely discussed in philosophy and has a very long history in intellectual considerations of the nature of the mind over the ages, both in the Western tradition and elsewhere. So we're going to talk about dualism here. We're going to focus on dualism to start with, and then we'll talk later on about monist alternatives to dualism. Dualism admits in the first instance of two fundamental varieties. One is called substance dualism, and the other is called property dualism. So substance dualists claim that minds and bodies are fundamentally and irreducibly distinct kinds of things. And by thing, another word that's used here is a substance or a stuff. So a kind of a metaphysical individual, like a person, say, or a tree or a pencil. These would all be things which would count as substances. Property dualism, on the other hand, is the view that minds and bodies have irreducibly, fundamentally distinct kinds of attributes or properties or features. There might not be a different thing involved, but there are irreducibly different kinds of properties that that one thing has, that has mental properties on the one hand and physical properties on the other, and the mental properties cannot be reduced to or explained in terms of the physical properties. With respect to the mind, typically, we're thinking about explanation of mental properties in terms of what goes on in the brain, say. So related to this, we can think about these two questions. The question about what's a substance and the related question about what's a property. So to get a fix on this, just note that a substance is the kind of thing that could, in principle, exist all by itself. So we can imagine a possible world that contained just that thing. So, your favorite pencil, for example, is a substance because we can imagine a world that contained nothing apart from that pencil. In contrast to that, properties are things that cannot exist just by themselves. So say your favorite pencil is yellow. So it's a yellow pencil, one of those sort of classic yellow pencils. And we can talk about this property that the pencil has, the color that it has on the outside, that yellow, that shade of yellow, that lovely shade of yellow that your pencil has. Now, that property, that shade of yellow, is not something that could exist in a world all by itself, right? There's no possible world in which there's just that color, yellow. There could be a world, a possible world, that consisted of only one thing that had that property, but we couldn't imagine a world that just had that color in it. It would have to be something that had that color, or a colored thing of that shade. So that's a way of thinking about the distinction. Now, in reflecting on dualism, there's a philosopher who's been extremely important in the history of discussion here, and that's René Descartes. He was born shortly before the end of the 16th century and died about halfway through the 17th century. And Descartes was an enormously influential figure in philosophy, both in the philosophy of mind, in terms of the mind-body problem, but also, as we'll see later, he was very important and influential in epistemology. So we'll talk about Descartes later on when we come to talk about skepticism. So Descartes is well known, among other things, for defending a view called interactionism, which is sometimes also called Cartesian dualism. So Cartesian dualism is a variety of substance dualism, according to which minds and bodies are fundamentally different kinds of things that causally interact with one another. That is, they causally interact in both directions. So Descartes claimed that a mind is what he called a res cogitans, and this translates as a thing that thinks, a substance that thinks, where thinking is a kind of mental activity. Whereas a body, or a part of a body, like a brain, is what he called a res extensa, or a thing that's extended in space. It fills space. And Descartes' official view about people was that each of us, each person, is a union or a compound or composite of a mental substance on the one hand, or a soul, a thinking thing, and a physical substance on the other, that is, a body. So when we think about interactionism of the sort that Descartes endorsed, we can see that it's a fairly intuitive way of thinking about the relationship between mind and body. So, for example, you might form the decision to throw a brick at someone. So that's a mental event. Up here, we have mental events. That's the mental world. And down here below these arrows, we have the physical world. So the decision to throw causes the physical act of throwing. Then, in the physical world still, the brick that's thrown hits someone in the forehead, not the same person presumably, and back in the mental world, that person who was hit by the brick, there's a mental result, which is that person is in pain. Presumably they're also been physically injured as well, they had some bodily injury. But the point is that the physical event of the brick hitting their forehead causes them to feel in pain. And so we see that's what's going on. There's a way in which the physical and the mental world interact. So the mental world has an effect on the physical world and vice versa. Now, why should we think this is the right way to think about it? Well, we mentioned this before, so it's perhaps a bit much to emphasize it again, but it's worth keeping in mind that this is highly intuitive. We think that our behavior, for example, is caused by our mental events. Our going to the store, our going to a coffee shop, is caused, we tend to think, by our beliefs and our desires about the world. So, why is it that you find yourself going to Starbucks? It's because you want a cup of coffee, and you think that there'll be coffee at Starbucks. I mean, you have a pretty good reason to think that's the case. So your behavior of walking over to the cafe is explained by your mental states. In this case, your beliefs and desires. So that's the causal influence in one direction, the mental influencing the physical. And it goes in the other way as well, right? So as we mentioned earlier, bodily events, neurological events, for example, also cause or seem to cause mental events. So, you go to Starbucks and you order a, grande coffee fairly late in the day or early in the evening, and you can't fall asleep. And the explanation we want to give about that typically is that, the reason you can't fall asleep is that you drank too much coffee. You ingested too much caffeine. So there's an effect of your ingesting this caffeine, a chemical effect, which resulted in an effect on your mental life. Now, in terms of thinking more globally about substance dualism, Descartes' view, according to which mental and physical substances causally interact, was not the only view around. if you think that mental and physical substances causally interact, then you will be in Descartes' camp. You'll be an interactionist, or, as we mentioned before, a Cartesian dualist. But you might think that's not the case. You might think that mental and physical substances don't actually causally interact, they just appear to. And going along with this line, we think about the history here, these alternative positions have been defended by philosophers. So the philosopher Leibniz, for example, and the philosopher Malebranche both defended views of the relation between mind and body, which accepted the idea of substance dualism, but rejected Descartes' further claim about the causal commerce between the mental and the physical. So Leibniz defended this view known as parallelism. He was a German philosopher working in the 17th century. And on his view, the mind and body simply looked as if they were causally interacting, but in fact they were programmed by God to be in pre-established harmony. And Leibniz drew a parallel, as it were, between the mental and bodily relation, the synchronization between these two things, and the way a shopkeeper might come into their shop at the beginning of the day and synchronize to the clocks in the shop. So that it looks like the clocks are actually, going along, and there's they're synchronized to be in the same time, and so there's a kind of linkage between them, but the linkage is completely artificial. So if we contrast this story to the one that we had in our earlier presentation of interactionism, God is really doing a lot of the work. So there's no, as you can see, the events that are unfolding in the mental domain are the same, in the physical domain, the same as the decision to throw on the one hand, and then there's pain. And in the physical world, there's the act of throwing, and there's the brick hitting somebody in the forehead. But there are no causal arrows here, right? There's no causation. God just sort of set things up from the outset so that things ran along that way. And then we interpret the situation as being one of element causation, but that's in fact just an illusion. Malebranche was a French philosopher, also a contemporary of Leibniz, who defended a view called occasionalism. And his idea was similar to Leibniz's, but his idea was that the sort of coordination between the mental and physical domains was due to a sort of an ongoing intervention on the part of God. So once again, there's no causal interaction, but rather than God having set things up to run, in advance in such a way that it looks like there's a causal interaction, God is actually intervening moment to moment to make these apparent causal connections appear. So whereas on Descartes' view, the decision to throw the brick actually causes the brick to be thrown, on the occasionalist view, defended by Malebranche, it's God who causes the throwing of the brick. That's God's work there. And similarly, in the later case, when the bricks hitting the person's forehead causes them to be in pain, that causal connection is actually not a connection between the physical and the mental, but it's something that God has brought about in virtue of his agency. So that's another way of thinking about the relationship between minds and bodies, which conforms to Descartes' assumption that minds and bodies are fundamentally, irreducibly different kinds of substances, but gives up the idea that there's any kind of direct causal interaction between minds and bodies.